It is November 26, 1943. High above the gray skies of northern France, the morning sun cuts through the overcast like cold steel. Contrails stretch across the heavens, long white scars of a war fought in the thin air between life and death. At 26,000 feet, a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts escorts B-17 bombers returning from a raid over Bremen. Below them, dark specks rise from the horizon. Focke-Wulf 190s. The Luftwaffe is hunting again. The first bursts of cannon fire flash past the Thunderbolts. One American pilot, his oxygen mask fogging, pushes the throttle forward. The massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 roars like a wild animal. The jug tilts nose down, a controlled fall into chaos. The air screams. The altimeter spins. The wings shudder as the speed needle races past 500 miles per hour. Behind him, the German fighters try to follow. But their controls stiffen. Their wings tremble. One by one, they pull out. Too soon, too late, too afraid. Down below, the P-47 plunges into the clouds and vanishes. When it reappears, miles away and untouched, one Luftwaffe pilot radios in disbelief. The Thunderbolt dives like a stone, faster than any plane alive. By the end of 1942, the Second World War had engulfed the skies of Europe in a brutal, endless duel. The Luftwaffe, honed by years of combats in Spain and Poland, ruled the air with precision and ferocity. Its twin pillars, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FWT, Dadritude 190, gave Germany a decisive edge over most Allied aircraft. When the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, entered the European theater, they brought determination and numbers, but not yet dominance. The 8th Air Force, operating from English bases, began daylight strategic bombing campaigns deep into German-held territory. It was a bold concept. Destroy the Nazi war machine by striking its factories, railways, and oil fields in broad daylight, where accuracy was highest. But daylight brought visibility, and visibility brought death. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lumbered across the continent with limited escort range. Once the P-38s and Spitfires turned back near the French coast, the bombers were alone, slow, heavy, and easy targets for the Luftwaffe's interceptors. From 1942 into 1943, the sky became a slaughterhouse. Entire bomber groups were torn apart before even reaching their objectives. Reports from the missions over Schweinfurt and Regensburg read like obituaries. Losses of 60 bombers in a single day were not rare. American crews spoke of flaming aircraft falling in spirals, of parachutes opening far too late, of radio silence broken only by Mayday calls. The Luftwaffe, disciplined and technically superior, exploited every weakness. Their fighters struck from above and behind, diving out of the sun in high-speed attacks. The FW-190A, with its radial engine and wide wings, could outturn and outclimb almost any Allied fighter at medium altitude. The Bf-109G, though aging, remained lethal in the hands of seasoned German aces. The Americans desperately needed an escort fighter capable of meeting these machines on equal terms, or better, surpassing them, but the challenges were enormous. Range, altitude, and power all collided with engineering limits. A fighter fast enough to chase the Luftwaffe often couldn't fly far enough to reach Germany. One sturdy enough to survive high-altitude combat often couldn't turn sharply enough to fight effectively. In early 1943, many in the Air Force Command believed there was no perfect solution. They were wrong. In a quiet factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, a team of engineers led by Alexander Kartveli was about to unleash something radical. a plane so large it looked absurd beside the sleek European fighters, yet so powerful that its very bulk would become its advantage. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a contradiction. A fighter built like a tank, powered by one of the largest piston engines ever installed in a single-engine aircraft. It weighed over 10,000 pounds, almost twice that of a Bf-109. Pilots joked it was a bomber with one seat. But behind the jokes lay something extraordinary. An engineering revolution designed not for elegance, but survival. At first, few believed in it. Early test pilots complained about its sluggishness and poor climb. The cockpit sat high, the nose enormous, and its turning circle was wide. The P-47 was mocked by British and American crews alike, until they began to understand what it could really do. For at high altitude, where air thins and engines gasp, the Thunderbolt did something no other Allied fighter could. Its massive turbo-supercharger system, a complex network of ducts and turbines stretching through the fuselage, kept its engine breathing at 30,000 feet, as if still flying at sea level. And when pushed into a dive, its heavy frame and aerodynamic design gave it a new kind of weapon. Raw, unrestrained speed. That speed would soon terrify the Luftwaffe, but in 1943 it was still a rumor in the making. The bombers kept flying, the losses kept mounting, and the P-47's reputation had yet to be written. A storm gathering on the edges of the war-torn sky, and in that storm's heart stood a new generation of pilots learning to tame the beast. The Republic Aviation Corporation was not known for finesse. Its founder, Alexander Kartveli, had already designed the rugged P-35 and P-43 Lancer, aircraft that valued strength and survivability over grace. But in 1940, as reports from Europe described the devastating efficiency of German air power, Kartveli realized that the next American fighter could not afford fragility. He proposed something radical, a machine that would rely not on agility, but on brute horsepower, durability, and altitude performance. The concept seemed almost absurd. A fighter so large it required the biggest engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder radial that was itself a marvel of American engineering. To feed this engine, Kartveli added a turbo-supercharger system, a labyrinth of pipes running from the engine to a turbine mounted in the tail, compressing thin air into dense oxygen-rich fuel mixture even at the stratosphere. It was an engineering masterpiece, but it made the fuselage enormous. The result was an aircraft unlike any the Air Force had ever seen. When the prototype XP-47B rolled out in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, test pilots gawked at its size. One remarked, "If it ever flies, it'll bring its own hangar with it." Yet when it did fly, something incredible happened. It didn't just lift off. It climbed with the roar of a small thunderstorm. Still, acceptance was slow. Early Thunderbolts were heavy and temperamental. The long turbo system overheated. The cockpit visibility was limited. Maintenance crews complained that changing the spark plugs required acrobatics. Even so, Republic kept refining the design, improving airflow, armor, and armament. The P-47 carried 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. More firepower than any single-engine fighter in the world. A single burst could shred a locomotive or tear apart a bomber. But for a while, few pilots could exploit that power effectively. In 1943, the first Thunderbolts arrived in England with the 56th Fighter Group, under Colonel Hubert Zemke. His men, initially skeptical, called the plane Jug, short for Juggernaut. It was meant as a joke. Until the name stuck. Zemke was a visionary. He understood the aircraft's weight wasn't a weakness. It was armor. The P-47 could take punishment no Spitfire could survive. As the 56th began escort missions, pilots started to experiment. They discovered that while the Jug struggled to climb or turn tightly at low altitude, it excelled where few could follow, in dives. A P-47 could point its nose downward from 30,000 feet and accelerate past 500 mm Trümbern faster than any operational fighter in Europe. German aircraft, lighter but less stable, risked structural failure beyond 450 mm. Soon, Zemke's men developed tactics to exploit this. When outnumbered, they climbed high and used gravity itself as their weapon. Dive, fire, escape. Never linger. Never turn. The Germans called it boom and zoom. The Americans called it survival. At the same time, the P-47's range problem was being solved. Drop tanks extended its escort reach deep into France and the Low Countries, eventually allowing Thunderbolts to meet bombers almost to the edge of Germany. For the first time, the B-17 crews looked out their windows and saw protection, the silver wings of Thunderbolts glinting beside them. As months passed, reports began reaching Luftwaffe intelligence officers. They noted a disturbing trend. The new American fighter could outdive any German interceptor. Pilots reported losing Thunderbolts during chases, not because they were shot down, but because they vanished into the clouds, accelerating to impossible speeds. This change marked a turning point in the air war's psychology. The Luftwaffe's greatest weapon had been fear, the certainty that German fighters ruled the sky. But the P-47 eroded that belief with every mission. It was not elegant, but it was relentless. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt had become the backbone of the 8th Air Force's fighter groups. The legend of the Jug was growing. A machine that could take hits, dive through hell, and come back roaring. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare in the sky, one defined by altitude, speed, and survivability. And as the war raged on, those traits would soon converge into a single, terrifying demonstration, the dive that left the Luftwaffe stunned. For the young American pilots arriving in England in 1943, the P-47 was more than a new aircraft. It was a challenge to everything they had been taught about flying. Most had trained on nimble trainers or P-40s that could roll and turn like dancers. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, felt like a brawler. It was heavy, unyielding, and initially intimidating. On the runway, its long nose seemed to swallow the horizon. Taxiing required leaning the aircraft from side to side to see the ground ahead. Many pilots joked that the P-47 took off not by flying, but by falling forward until it reached enough speed to stay in the air. But once airborne, its true nature emerged. The vast cockpit offered an unmatched sense of protection. Armored glass, thick plating behind the seat, and a reinforced canopy that felt like a cocoon of steel and glass. The Pratt & Whitney engine, a deep-throated beast, delivered a raw, steady vibration that pilots came to love. It didn't whine like a Merlin. It growled. Those who flew it long enough learned a truth that couldn't be read in manuals. The Thunderbolt would keep you alive. Pilots returned from missions with wings shredded by flak, oil pressure failing, or cylinders blown. Yet the aircraft limped home. Ground crews told stories of bullet-riddled Jugs belly-landing in mud fields, the pilot stepping out unscathed. The P-47 wasn't about elegance. It was about endurance, a reflection of the men who flew it. Many were barely 20, carrying the weight of missions that often saw half their friends vanish before lunch. In a war of attrition, the Thunderbolt's resilience became a form of hope. If you could make it into a dive, one pilot said, you could make it home. The P-47's technological heart lay deep within its fuselage. The General Electric turbo supercharger system, an innovation that defined its superiority at altitude. While most fighters relied on mechanical superchargers bolted directly to the engine, the P-47 used an intricate system of pipes and turbines stretching nearly 20 feet through the aircraft. Exhaust gases from the engine drove a turbine in the tail, compressing incoming air and feeding it back to the engine through a network of ducts and intercoolers. It was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering and a nightmare for maintenance crews. But the payoff was monumental. The Thunderbolt could sustain full power above 30,000 feet, where Luftwaffe aircraft began to gasp for oxygen. It gave American pilots the ability to engage or disengage at will, dictating the terms of combat. Aerodynamically, the P-47 was deceptively advanced. Its elliptical wings, massive propeller, and razorback spine gave it stability in high-speed dives. In tests, it exceeded speeds that pushed the boundaries of what piston aircraft could safely endure. Compressibility, the invisible wall of air resistance approaching the speed of sound, was still poorly understood in 1943. Yet P-47 pilots routinely brushed against it, surviving dives that destroyed lighter aircraft. When early test flights reported altimeters freezing past 500 megahertz, engineers realized that the Thunderbolt's sheer weight and structure were doing something extraordinary, using gravity as an ally. Its immense mass gave it momentum that no German aircraft could match in descent. The Luftwaffe's fighters, sleek but lightly built, encountered violent control lockups past 475-meter mph. The Thunderbolt, with its reinforced wings and robust control surfaces, remained manageable at speeds that left German pilots helpless. It was not just speed. It was survivable speed. That difference would soon decide life or death for hundreds of men in the months to come. From the German perspective, the P-47 appeared almost alien. When it first entered combat, Luftwaffe pilots were dismissive. They saw a large, ungainly American brute, slow to turn, easy to spot, and surely easy to kill. In early dogfights, that arrogance sometimes paid off, but by mid-1943, reports began filtering back to command posts that something was changing. German interceptors, especially FW-190As, were failing to bring down Thunderbolts as expected. The P-47s absorbed hits and still returned fire with 8 machine guns that tore through armor plating. When cornered, they dove and disappeared. Intelligence briefings from Luftwaffe described the phenomenon with growing alarm. German engineers tested the claim in wind tunnels and flight trials. They confirmed the terrifying truth: their aircraft could not safely follow a Thunderbolt into a steep dive. The control surfaces of the FW-190 stiffened dangerously near 480 mm, while the P-47 remained controllable well beyond that limit. To the Luftwaffe pilots who had once dominated the skies, it was a shattering realization. Their sense of superiority, forged since 1939, was being challenged by an American machine they had mocked only months before. By the end of 1943, radio chatter across German squadrons began to carry a new warning. Don't follow the Jug into the dive. You'll never come back. The disbelief turned into respect, and respect into fear. The battlefield had shifted, not just in machinery, but in mindset, and from that shift emerged a new style of aerial warfare, one that turned altitude and gravity into the deadliest allies of the P-47. In early 1943, American fighter tactics in Europe were still evolving. Many squadrons entered combat clinging to ideas from the First World War: tight formations, turning dogfights, and heroism through proximity. The Luftwaffe had long since abandoned such notions, relying instead on energy fighting, climbing and diving to exploit momentum, not maneuver. The P-47 Thunderbolt forced the Americans to learn this the hard way. In its early missions, pilots who tried to turn fight Focke-Wulfs or Messerschmitts rarely returned. The Thunderbolt's weight meant that once it lost energy, it took precious seconds to regain it. Seconds that could cost a life. Then came a shift in thinking, led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke studied his aircraft with an engineer's eye and a survivor's pragmatism. He realized that in the right hands, the P-47's mass was not a limitation, but a weapon. Instead of fighting horizontally, he taught his men to fight vertically, to own the sky from top to bottom. His philosophy was simple. Climb higher than your enemy, dive at him in controlled fury, fire once, and escape using the aircraft's incredible momentum. Don't turn back. Don't linger. Strike, vanish, and climb again. This boom and zoom doctrine transformed the air war. It was not about acrobatics. It was about physics. A P-47 diving from 30,000 feet could reach speeds beyond what German pilots dared to attempt. Its heavy frame, designed for stability, made recovery possible when others would disintegrate. Soon, entire squadrons began executing dives with near mathematical precision. The sky became a chessboard, and altitude the winning piece. Luftwaffe formations, once confident, found themselves ambushed by unseen enemies dropping out of the sun. The P-47's dive was not merely a tactic. It was a declaration. A new form of air warfare where momentum replaced maneuver, and gravity itself became an ally. Leadership in wartime is rarely about charisma alone. It is about seeing patterns amid chaos. Hubert Zemke, a Montana-born pilot with sharp intellect and quiet authority, embodied that rare balance. When he took command of the 56th Fighter Group, morale was low, and confidence in the P-47 lower still. He changed that by building a culture around trust. Trust in the aircraft, trust in data, and trust in one another. Zemke personally flew test dives to map the Thunderbolt's limits. He pushed it past compressibility, noting how the controls stiffened and how recovery depended on altitude and throttle. He then shared those findings in brutally honest debriefs. "Don't fear the dive," he told his men. "Fear ignorance." His approach fostered innovation. Pilots like Francis Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and David Schilling became legends under his command, refining the art of attack and escape. The 56th soon earned the nickname Zemke's Wolfpack. They hunted as a unit, communicating with discipline and precision. Radio chatter was minimal, timing exact. Each pilot knew his altitude, his escape vector, his role. In combat, they appeared chaotic to German observers, but every move was calculated. By late 1943, the Wolfpack had become one of the most feared fighter groups in Europe. Their kill-to-loss ratio soared, and their success began to shift USAF doctrine across the theater. Zemke's reports were circulated through command, influencing how the P-47 and later the P-51 would be flown for the remainder of the war. Yet Zemke never glorified the killing. In private letters, he wrote of his pilots' exhaustion, of the quiet after takeoff, when men wondered who would not return. His leadership was not built on bravado, but on realism, the understanding that survival was victory enough. Under him, the Thunderbolt became not just a machine of war, but a philosophy: resilience, precision, and endurance in the face of chaos. Every technological leap in war carries a human cost. For the Thunderbolt pilots, the power of their machine was both protection and burden. Their missions often ended not in air-to-air combat, but in scenes of devastation on the ground. Strafing trains, columns, and airfields, the 850 caliber guns that had once saved their lives in dogfights now tore through vehicles and men with industrial efficiency. Pilots described the recoil vibrating through the fuselage, the smell of cordite filling the cockpit, and the flicker of tracers below. Victory was measurable in destruction. Yet in letters home, many pilots confessed discomfort. They admired the P-47's might, but understood its moral weight. The aircraft's survivability meant they lived longer than most. Long enough to witness more loss, more death, more empty bunks. By 1944, the airfields of East Anglia were lined with rows of names painted on Thunderbolt cowlings. Memorials as much as nicknames. Misbehave, Lucky 13, Half Pint. Each represented men who had once laughed, gambled, and planned for life after the war. Some survived the entire campaign. Many did not. The P-47's legacy among its pilots was paradoxical. Immense pride mixed with quiet sorrow. They revered it not because it made them invincible, but because it gave them a chance. A fighting chance. In a sky that rarely offered second ones. In their eyes, the jug was more than metal and fuel. It was a shield, a companion, and a witness to the hardest choices a man could make. And those choices would soon be tested in the battles that defined 1943 and 1944, when the Thunderbolt dove faster than physics should allow, and the Luftwaffe finally understood what it meant to face gravity itself. By the spring of 1943, the European air war had reached its breaking point. American daylight bombing continued at enormous cost, while the Luftwaffe still ruled the high air over France and Germany. But something had begun to change. In air bases across southern England, at Halesworth, Boxted, and Debden, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 8th Air Force were taking off daily, heavier, faster, and more confident. Every pilot who returned alive carried new data: air speeds, control behavior, climb rates, dive recovery points. Each mission refined the science of survival. By summer 1943, these experiments would culminate in one of the most shocking demonstrations of aerial dominance ever recorded. It was July 30th, 1943. At dawn, B-17 flying fortresses of the 91st Bomb Group lifted off from Bassingbourn and other English fields, bound for the industrial heart of Bremen. The target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft plant, the same factory that produced the Luftwaffe's feared FW-190. Above the bomber streams, the 56th Fighter Group flew cover. Colonel Zemke himself led one of the escort squadrons. They would stay with the bombers as far as their limited fuel allowed, then fight their way home. Crossing the French coast, the bomber formation drew attention almost immediately. Ground radar in occupied France picked them up, and Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled from bases near Lille and Amiens. Dozens of FW-190s and Bf-109Gs climbed through the haze, black crosses glinting in the morning sun. At 25,000 feet, the two air forces met. The Germans attacked from above, diving through the formation, spraying cannon shells, and climbing back into the sun, their traditional tactic. But today, the Thunderbolts were waiting. One flight of P-47s rolled inverted and dove to intercept. The lead pilot, Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, saw a pair of FW-190s slicing through the clouds below. He nosed his jug down and followed, throttles wide open, propellers screaming. At 400 mpg, the air began to compress. His controls stiffened, but he kept pushing. Behind him, the German fighters tried to shake free. They expected the big American plane to pull out early, as most Allied aircraft did. But the P-47 didn't. The altimeter needle spun. 22,000 passive, $17,000. $12,000. The dive deepened, the roar turning into a continuous metallic howl. Mahurin's speed indicator pushed past 500 mph, beyond the safe limit printed in the manual. The German pilots attempted to follow, their control sticks locked solid. One W190 snapped into a half-roll and disintegrated. The other, panicking, yanked back too hard, tearing a wing from the fuselage. Mahurin leveled out at 8,000 Wattfeft, his canopy rattling, oil pressure dropping, hands trembling from the force. He pulled back up through the haze, alive, intact, and alone. The Germans were gone. When he rejoined the formation, the radio crackled with disbelief. Pilots from multiple squadrons reported the same thing. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any aircraft they'd ever seen, and lived to tell it. The event was logged, studied, and later confirmed by flight data from Republic Aviation. In controlled tests, Thunderbolts exceeded Mach 0.83, surviving speeds once believed fatal to piston aircraft. The phenomenon of compressibility, the strange wall of aerodynamic resistance near transonic speed, had nearly killed early test pilots. But somehow, the Jug's design, its thick wings, its strong control surfaces, its sheer weight, allowed it to punch through and recover. To the Luftwaffe, this discovery was devastating. The dive had always been their escape, their final advantage against Allied pursuers. Now, it belonged to the Americans. In the following weeks, German intelligence began compiling reports of unusual diving characteristics among new American fighters. The Thunderbolt's legend grew faster than its airspeed. Pilots who once mocked it as slow and clumsy now feared it. When P-47s appeared at high altitude, German formations scattered, wary of being lured into an unwinnable chase. Luftwaffe ace Major Heinz Baer, himself a veteran of more than 200 victories, described the new reality with grim respect. The Thunderbolt is heavy, but it is indestructible. If you see it go down, do not follow. It will return. In that single shift, from pursuit to avoidance, the Luftwaffe lost its confidence. American pilots, empowered by the new tactic, began using the dive offensively. Instead of simply escaping, they turned it into a weapon. Climb high, strike fast, dive away. The same principle Zemke had preached, now backed by physics itself. What had once been survival became supremacy. And from that supremacy came a chain reaction that changed the air war entirely. For every bomber saved, for every German plane forced down, the strategic balance tilted. The dive of the Thunderbolt was no longer a maneuver. It was a message, and the message was clear. The Luftwaffe could no longer hide in its own sky. From this moment onward, the air over Europe would never feel the same again. But the story was not yet complete. Because what began as a desperate defense soon evolved into total aerial dominance. The legend of the P-47's dive spread quickly through Allied command. Within weeks of the Bremen mission, combat analysis teams gathered flight data, pilot testimonies, and engineering reports. What they found confirmed what the airmen already knew by instinct. The Thunderbolt could not only outdive the enemy, it could do so repeatedly, safely, and decisively. By autumn 1943, Colonel Hubert Zemke and his 56th Fighter Group began formalizing this into doctrine. They called it energy warfare. It was a discipline built on altitude advantage, controlled aggression, and the calculated use of gravity. Zemke's Wolfpack, stationed at Halesworth, became the proving ground. They flew in rotating squadrons, each pilot trained to visualize combat not as a brawl, but as an equation. Potential energy, kinetic energy, and escape vectors. The goal was not to win every dogfight, but to control when and how combat began and ended. Soon, The results were undeniable. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's dominance had begun to fracture. Reports from the German Fighter Command, Jagdgeschwader, revealed alarming trends: increasing pilot fatigue, falling morale, and an ever-widening performance gap at high altitudes. Thunderbolts escorted bombers deeper into Europe than ever before. New drop tanks extended their reach to the Rhine and beyond. American formations now had constant protection on both ingress and egress, a nightmare for the Luftwaffe, whose interceptors were forced to fight on unfavorable terms. The Germans still had remarkable machines. The FW-190A8 and the BF-5 CT-ETHI on 9G6 were formidable, but they were designed for agility, not endurance. Their lighter airframes gave them an edge in short, close engagements, but the P-47s refused to play that game. At high altitude, the Thunderbolt was nearly untouchable. Its turbo-supercharged engine maintained power long after German engines gasped for air. At low altitude, its dive recovery and durability gave it unmatched survivability. It could fight vertically through the entire altitude spectrum, from 35,000 feet down to treetop level, and return home battered but breathing. Zemkes. Men began using this advantage ruthlessly. Each engagement began the same way: climb high, wait for interception, then dive in waves. The P-47 struck like falling thunder. In a single raid escort over Emden in March 1944, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 29 enemy aircraft destroyed with only one loss. German pilots described the Thunderbolts as coming from nowhere, diving through their formations at impossible speeds, vanishing, then climbing again to strike from another angle. The Luftwaffe command attempted countermeasures. New intercept tactics called for head-on attacks against bombers while avoiding prolonged engagements with escorts. But even these proved futile when the Thunderbolts began taking the fight back to German airfields. By mid-1944, the P-47 had evolved into something far more than an escort. It became a hunter. Armed with bombs and rockets, the Jug began striking railway yards, fuel depots, and transport convoys, crippling the Luftwaffe's ability to launch at all. The same dive that once saved pilots now served to deliver destruction from above. The war in the air had changed from duel to dominance. Inside German command rooms, the mood darkened. Generals Adolf Galland and Günther Lützow, both veterans of the Battle of Britain, warned that the Reich's fighter arm was being bled dry. For every American loss, Germany lost 3, often including irreplaceable veterans. Fuel shortages worsened the crisis. Many Luftwaffe units could barely maintain flight training. By contrast, American pilots flew constantly. Their aircraft were maintained, their engines replaced, their tactics refined. Each mission made them better, while each German loss made the enemy weaker. The P-47's impact was not just mechanical, it was psychological. The Luftwaffe had built its identity on mastery of the sky. Now, German pilots entered combat knowing their aircraft could not follow the Thunderbolt into a dive. The ultimate loss of initiative. Luftwaffe ace Franz Stiegler, who would later famously spare a crippled B-17 over Germany, recalled watching Thunderbolts dive away and realizing he could do nothing but pull out and climb. "It was like chasing ghosts," he said. "You saw them, fired, and then they were gone. Faster than the earth itself. That helplessness eroded morale faster than attrition." By June 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, the once proud German fighter wings were shadows of their former selves. The sky above the invasion beaches was dominated by Allied air power, much of it flown by P-47s providing cover, strafing convoys, and blasting artillery positions. The Jug had completed its transformation, from a defensive escort to a symbol of total aerial superiority. When historians later traced the collapse of the Luftwaffe, they found no single battle or machine that sealed its fate, but a series of shifts in balance, each compounding the next. The P-47's dive was one such shift. It marked the moment when the German Air Force lost its final uncontested domain: speed. After 1944, no German pilot could claim to own the vertical sky. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang would later extend the Allies' reach deeper into Germany, but it was the Thunderbolt that broke the myth of invincibility. The Luftwaffe's downfall was not only a product of attrition, but of disbelief. Disbelief that their hunters had become the hunted. When American crews returned from missions now, they brought not grief, but confidence. The radio chatter that once carried desperate calls now carried calm efficiency. The balance had shifted irreversibly. Above the ruins of Europe, the sky belonged to a new kind of warrior, one who had learned to ride gravity itself. But the victory came with a price. The Thunderbolt's might was born of necessity and paid for in human cost, on both sides of the war. And as the smoke cleared, the question would remain: what happens to the men who wield such power once the fighting stops? By the start of 1944, the transformation was undeniable. What had begun as a desperate defense over the skies of England had turned into an unstoppable offensive across the heart of Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once dismissed as clumsy, now ruled the air with mathematical precision. Its reputation was no longer rumor. It was fact, proven in the reports and wreckage scattered across fields from Normandy to Berlin. The numbers told the story. Between March 1943 and May 1944, Thunderbolt pilots of the 8th and 9th Air Forces claimed over 3,700 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, and thousands more on the ground. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons vanished from the order of battle. The price was high. More than 3,000 P-47s were lost in combat or operational accidents, and thousands of pilots never returned. But for the first time, American bombers were reaching their targets and coming home in increasing numbers. The bombing campaigns over Germany, once considered near suicidal, now struck with relentless frequency. The Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants, the Leuna fuel refineries, the synthetic oil fields at Politz and Merseburg, all fell under relentless assault, shielded by a wall of thunderbolts. German industry began to suffocate. Without fuel, without bearings, without air cover, the Wehrmacht's war machine faltered. Tanks could no longer move. Trains stopped running. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe were now a killing field they could barely enter. But victory came wrapped in silence. Every triumph in the air left absence on the ground. Empty bunks, unopened letters, empty chairs in the mess hall. Thunderbolt pilots were surviving longer than most. But survival carried its own burden. Many spoke of combat fatigue, though the term would later evolve into what we now call PTSD. The long hours at altitude, the sudden deaths of comrades, the haunting quiet after missions. It wore down even the strongest minds. Some pilots coped with gallows humor, others with silence. Colonel Zemke, ever the leader, enforced rest rotations and demanded discipline not just in combat, but in recovery. He understood what unspoken exhaustion could do. A man can only fly so many missions before he starts seeing ghosts in the clouds, he once said. On the German side, the toll was worse. The Luftwaffe, once filled with skilled veterans, was reduced to desperate youth. Many new recruits were barely trained before being sent into combat against opponents who had hundreds of hours of flight experience. By 1944, the average lifespan of a German fighter pilot on the Western Front was less than 10 missions. Some never returned from their first. Reports from captured German officers described morale collapsing under the relentless American air presence. One interrogation transcript recorded a Luftwaffe commander's grim assessment. "It is not that we have lost the war in the air. It is that we cannot afford to fly it anymore." The Thunderbolt had achieved what few machines in history ever could. It changed the psychology of an entire theater of war. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in the West. What remained were isolated squadrons, often low on fuel, facing swarms of Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Spitfires. The Thunderbolt, now equipped for ground attack, extended its reach beyond the air war. It became the spearhead of the 9th Air Force's tactical operations, destroying supply convoys, bridges, and troop concentrations in support of the Allied advance after D-Day. The same dive that once saved its pilots from pursuit now delivered precision strikes from above. The aircraft's 8 machine guns, once aimed at Messerschmitts, now shredded armored columns on the retreat from Normandy. But for all its might, the Jug's dominance carried a strange melancholy. Pilots no longer spoke of glory, only of endurance. The air war had become mechanical, inevitable, and merciless. Victory in the sky meant death below. The war's end was approaching, but its shadow would linger in every pilot who had lived through those missions. Men who had learned to master gravity and survive its consequences. And yet, as 1945 approached, the Thunderbolt still had one final chapter to write. The story of its legacy, its transformation into a new kind of war machine, and its place in the memory of those who fought beneath its thunder. By the time 1945 dawned, the sound of the R-2800 engine had become the soundtrack of the collapsing Third Reich. The once feared Luftwaffe was a memory. Its fuel reserves dwindled to vapor, its pilots outmatched and outnumbered. But the P-47 was not done. It had found a new purpose, one that made full use of its power, protection, and speed. As Allied armies pushed across France and into Germany, the Thunderbolt's role shifted from aerial duels to battlefield dominance. The same qualities that had made it a diving monster against enemy fighters now made it ideal for close air support. Its rugged airframe could absorb flak hits that would rip apart lighter aircraft. Its 850 caliber guns, coupled with bombs and rockets, turned it into an airborne artillery piece. In the months before the Rhine crossings, P-47s roamed ahead of the Allied advance, destroying trains, tanks, and convoys. The Germans began to call them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber, a term spoken with a mixture of fear and resignation. Low over the fields of western Germany, the Thunderbolts appeared in pairs or trios, diving through clouds and unleashing streams of fire. Pilots could feel the shock waves of their own rockets rippling through the cockpit glass. They saw the chaos below. Columns scattering, bridges collapsing, smoke curling through frozen villages. Each mission carried the same rhythm: dive, strike, climb, and vanish into the gray. The same motion that had once saved them now brought destruction in its wake. By April 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. American and British columns converged on the Elbe. Overhead, the skies were crowded with aircraft, Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts, all symbols of a victory long fought for. In the final reports of the U.S. Army Air Forces, the P-47 stood as one of the most produced American fighters of the war. Over 15,000 built. It had destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft and thousands of locomotives, tanks, and vehicles. Yet statistics only tell part of the story. The true legacy of the Thunderbolt lay in the words of the men who flew it. Pilots remembered not its speed, but its loyalty. "She'd bring you home," they said, even when trailing smoke, even with holes in the wings, even with half the engine gone. After the war, many of those pilots would go on to fly the next generation of aircraft, the jet-powered F-80s and F-86. Yet almost all carried a photograph or a patch from their old Thunderbolt days. For them, the P-47 was not merely a machine. It was a companion that had carried them through the storm. Colonel Zemke survived the war, having spent the final months as a prisoner after his plane was shot down during a storm. When he returned, he spoke not of vengeance or pride, but of gratitude for his men, his machine, and the strange physics of fate that had let him survive. The Luftwaffe's veterans, too, would remember the Thunderbolt. In post-war interviews, many German aces admitted that it had been their most formidable foe, not because it was beautiful, but because it was relentless. When the war ended, the roar of the R-2800 faded from Europe's skies. The P-47 would soon be replaced by sleeker, faster jets, but its legend remained, carved into every cratered runway and every pilot's memory. For historians, the Thunderbolt came to symbolize a shift in the very nature of air warfare. It represented the industrial age of flight, where strength, endurance, and reliability triumphed over finesse. It was proof that engineering could shape destiny as surely as courage could. The Luftwaffe had once believed speed and agility would always prevail. The P-47 proved otherwise, that mass, power, and control of altitude could bend the laws of combat. By 1945, the sky belonged not to elegance, but to endurance. The Thunderbolt's thunder faded slowly, replaced by the jet's scream. But in every modern strike aircraft, from the F-86 Sabre to the A-10 Warthog, echoes of the Jug remain. And in that lineage, the dive that once stunned the Luftwaffe still reverberates, a reminder that even in the cold, thin air of war, gravity has a way of choosing its own heroes. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the skies over Europe fell silent. The contrails faded, the echo of engines dissolved into the wind, and for the first time in years, the pilots who had lived between Earth and eternity looked up and saw only peace. For many, it was an unfamiliar sight. The air, once a battlefield of noise and fire, had become an ocean of stillness. The Thunderbolt, that immense creation of steel, oil, and defiance, rested now on quiet airfields, its mission complete. But what it left behind was more than victory. It left understanding. The P-47 Thunderbolt was proof that survival was not a matter of luck or speed, but of design, courage, and the will to endure. It embodied a generation that fought not for glory, but to outlast destruction itself. Every rivet, every scar on its fuselage told the same story, that power and protection could coexist, that might need not be cruel, and that human ingenuity could turn even the laws of gravity into allies. For the Luftwaffe pilots who once ruled the skies, it was a bitter revelation. For the Americans who flew the Jug, it was a salvation built from metal and sweat. And for history, it was a turning point. The moment when war left romance behind and became an exact science of endurance. The lessons of the Thunderbolt lived on long after its last mission. Its descendants, the jet fighters and attack aircraft of later wars, carried forward the same philosophy: strength without fragility, speed without surrender, and survival as the ultimate victory. Even today, when one of the few remaining P-47s takes to the air at an air show, its deep, rolling engine note cuts through the sky like a heartbeat from another century. Crowds look up, and for a moment, they hear what the world once feared and depended on in equal measure. Thunder, controlled by human hands. In that sound lies the story of every man who ever dove into the unknown and lived to rise again. Because, in the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt was never just an aircraft. It was a promise that even in war's darkest descent, there is still the courage to climb back toward the light.